I'm happy to be with you here today. The first part of the talk will be about what we call evolution, or what's new in evolution these days. And in the second half of the talk, there will be some general considerations about what are requirements for a good classification in science in general. And we will finish with the relationship between classification and evolution, which is a complicated relationship. It has been complicated during the history of science, and it's still complicated, actually. What do we understand under, what do we, as normal persons, I would say. I wouldn't think right from the beginning about scientists, but common people, how do they think about evolution? What do they understand under this word? Evolution is often understood as a story to tell, sometimes based on a scala naturae, you know, the scale of beings, a kind of piling of organisms from the less complex to the most complex, and you can guess the most complex is obviously us, it's ourselves. In its worst version, it's a story to tell based on something from the primitive to something from the evolved. Sometimes you can find conferences which title could be evolution, from bacteria to humans, something very primitive to something very supposedly complex and evolved. And in the best situation, the story to tell is based on a tree, which is not a scale, but a tree is more complex. There is a dimension of relationship in a tree which is not in the scale. You can understand evolution as a process of change, of living lineages through time. You can understand evolution as a progress. Sometimes, often, there is a link between this view of evolution, when you see a scale, and the notion of progress. It has been very strong during the second half of the 19th century to the middle 20th century. There were a mix between the scala naturae and the notion of progress. If you go from the most simple organism to the most complex ones, it was understood implicitly, evolution was understood as a progress towards more complex things. And obviously, the humans were at the top. Evolution can be understood also as a theory used by several sciences. Biology first, obviously, paleontology, anthropology, and there are some others. The theoretical understanding of the term. We, as scientists, put more emphasis on this notion of evolution. We see it mostly, first of all, we see it as a theoretical framework into which you will understand changes, short-term changes in agronomy, for instance, or long-term changes in paleontology. Evolution will be a theory allowing us to interpret biological entities and also fossil entities, also human societies. And it's more or less here linked to what we call the patterns, the distribution of attributes across the variety of organism or biological entities, the distribution of attributes and the sharing of attributes, the sharing of characters, is understood as a pattern of evolution. Here you have more processes of evolution, a process of change, the process by which the biological lineages are going to change. As in many sciences, we do have these two epistemological frameworks. You see the world through patterns. What is it? Where does it come from? Who is sharing what with whom? the patterns, and the processes. How can it proceed? How can it happen? How can it occur? This is a how, and here this is a what is it, and where does it come from? There is, evolution is in your mind, and in all our minds, is entering into a cultural framework. And for many of our citizens, evolution has to be understood within a cultural heritage. And our cultural heritage is not really compatible to what evolution has to explain scientifically for the biological world. Most of the time, evolution is counterintuitive. Why evolution is counterintuitive? Because we don't see, first of all, your grandmother or your grandfather don't see any cat giving birth to anything else than cats. Mother cats make baby cats. I don't see evolution every day. Living things look like designed. Forms seems to fit the function we know for forms. And you know, we are accustomed to this idea that when you face a perfect fit between form and function, for us, for all of us, this is because the form has been anticipated to fit with the function we were wanting. We were wanting it to be performed. So for us, we are creatures that generate tools, and when we generate tools, we anticipate functions to occur, and we determine forms for the function to be accomplished, to be achieved. In evolution, it is the reverse. Function is not anticipated. Form is just what is it, and if its form is here, it's because in the past, function was the performance by which the form was maintained. So there is no design at all. It's very difficult for us to imagine that you can have an equation between form and function without design. And it is a very strong barrier, a very strong difficulty for our public to admit evolution, because if there is a fit between form and function, it is because forms has been designed for it, purposefully, I mean. You have this idea among our public that humans are not animals at all, and there is very strong, obviously, religious heritage about that. The three main monotheisms organize a separation between what is a human and what an animal is. And you have to choose. You are either an animal or a human, but you can be both in our cultural heritage. Evolution says the contrary. You are both an animal and a human. We will see how. Nature is perfect. You can still have this kind of consideration in biomimicry today. If you look at some American websites promoting biomimicry, that start from the point, right from the beginning, they start from the point of view that nature is necessarily perfect. And perfection is not a scientific notion, obviously. So evolution has nothing to do with perfection. Evolution will tell you how things work, and sometimes why things don't work. Nature is performance is not an absolute value. Performance is something you have. It's a continuous variable. I mean. And one of the main obstacles we have in reception of evolution by our public is that in our heritage from monotheisms, groups are real. Groups are causal. And you often find people thinking that cats have fur because they are mammals. The group is causal. The group to which you belong is the cause why you have the things you have. In science, it's the contrary. In science, cats are mammals because they have fur. So there is an inversion of causality in most of our mind, comparing to what evolution has to teach you about the scientific point of view of what natural creatures are. Unfortunately, school children don't hear about evolution because, in France at least, in France, school children don't hear about evolution before the age of 10 or 11 years old. And it's a difficulty in my own profession, my own job. It's a difficulty to try to fix this problem, is that we should teach evolution as early as possible. As early as possible, it means speaking about evolution of elements of evolution starting from 6 to 7 years old. It's possible. It's just a matter of being audacious in terms of pedagogy. Being, if you feel confident with the background and the pedagogy you have to invent, it's possible to do the job. But it's not the case because, you know, school systems are big machines and it's not so easy to change, but it's not a matter of intrinsic impossibility, epistemological or pedagogical difficulty. There's no difficulties of this kind. We are able to imagine pedagogic solutions for school children to hear about evolution as early as possible. Unfortunately, I will be back at the end about that. Unfortunately, they are taught about classification before being taught about evolution. But in science, evolution fixes the program of classification. If I can make it short, in science, evolution makes classification. But at school, you learn classification before you hear about evolution. So there is a complexity, pedagogical and sociological complexity about that. We will be back on that later. This relationship between classification and evolution is managed by a science that is called the systematics. Systematics is the science of classifications. This is a science which manages consistent links between objects, real objects, concepts, and names. And this relationship has to be as consistent as possible. It's not only a matter of giving a name to a specimen. This specimen is just a single individual. I mean, it doesn't represent the world by itself unless you make it, you construct a concept around it. And a concept has a geometry. So you have both to manage the geometry of the concept, the word you put on it, and the reference specimen somewhere. Otherwise, if you don't have a reference specimen somewhere, you know, biological world is changing. Whatever you do, the biological world is changing. So if you find a fly and a new fly and you describe it in a paper, you give a new name for the new fly, and if you forget to put an individual of the fly in a collection at a museum, sooner or later you even won't know what was it about, because fly populations change very, very fast. Or else you could go back to the place and the landscape has changed and the fly has just disappeared. So you don't know what was it. So you need reference collections to make this triangle work. This is the reason why there are museums which collection specimens. At the Museum of Natural History in Paris, we have 68 millions of specimens working like a kind of dictionary of nature. You have to maintain the consistency of names because things are changing always. And indeed, we have to face change. And there has always been a difficult relationship between the stability of the names, the stability of the concepts, and the things that we designate with these concepts, things that are changing. And the example I can give you here is a very simple one. This guy from this stage, 17 years old, to this stage, 75 years old, he has replaced all his cells. He has replaced all his matter. So what makes this individual here the same as the one that is here? Is it the same or not the same? If science is about describing a material world and rationally and collectively explaining this material world, if you follow the movements of matter, obviously this guy and this one are not the same anymore. They have replaced all these matters. Giving the same name from this step to this step is just a convention. It's just conventional. His name is Michel Simon, if you know him. I don't know if you know him, but I think you know him. Excuse me. I know him too. No, not personally, but so I could have decided to give a name to this step, different than the name at this step, different at the name at this step. This is what happens in some human populations of the Indian subcontinent. They decide to give a different name for the kid, the teenager, and the adult. It's just a convention. So names you put on things are conventional. It depends what are the geometries of the concept you are constructing. The French policy has a geometry of concepts that decides to give the same name from the birth to the death. So the name of this entity will be Michel Simon from the beginning until the end. But we could have decided in a different way. So it goes to the question, and very, very old philosophical questions, that when it changes, was it changing actually? It's a question that was already in the philosopher's mind in the Greek antiquity. If I'm describing the world precisely, following the movements of matter, I can't speak about nature anymore, because I will be obligated to give a name to each day of this guy, because he replaced his matter every day. It loses carbon atoms, it loses oxygen atoms, it replaced cells. So it's not the same from one day to another. If you push until the end, you will be obliged to give a different name every minute. So you can't say anything about the guy if you have a different name every minute, because it changes every minute. You understand? Okay. So there is a tension between the stability of language and the way the world is changing. And systematics is a permanent negotiation between the need for stability of our language in one side and the changing world on the other side. So I can do any biology by giving a surname for each tree or each bird I meet. I need words of some general extent, you know what I mean. So I have to negotiate about change. When I need to speak, I have to negotiate about change. When giving the name of Michel Simon to this guy from his birth to his death, in the language, I'm hiding the fact that he is changing. It's a convention, actually. What do you see here? Raise your hand if you see change. 10 people. Raise your hand if you see similarity. A little bit more. Okay. Do you see change or do you see similarity? This is the big question. Sorry? Both. Yes, some people would say both, indeed. And this tension has been in the history of biology and history of natural history right from the beginning. if I'm, without telling all the story, I don't have the time for this, but if you take Linnaeus at the beginning of the 18th century, Linnaeus was inclined to neglect variation, to neglect change, and focus on stability. So Linnaeus sees one species here. Only one species, one thing. He sees one thing, and variation is considered as corruption, material corruption of the ideal plan of God, of creation. So what was important is that all these animals look like each other because they were created by the hand of God, because God created all species actually. Species were will for Linnaeus. It was a direct expression of God's will. In a world that there was no evolution in that kind of thinking. So it is what we call idealism. Idealism is the category, the box you are producing in your mind, has an ontological priority over the individuals that represent it. So these individuals are linked to the category that transcends them, you know. They are linked with the category, with an essence they have inside. You are a woman, you wash the dish. You are a man, you repair the engine of the car. This is essentialism. You cannot escape from it. You are prisoner of the category into which someone else puts you. Okay? To make it short. Darwin, one century later, was rather inclined to see 24 things here, because he paid attention to variation. He paid attention to change. So categories made for thinking nature and naming nature, categories were considered as conventional. This is what we call nominalism. What exists in our species do not exist. Birds do not exist. Insects do not exist. These names are given to boxes, and these boxes are in our mind. Here outside, they are just individuals. So you can say there is no birds outside there. Birds, it's a clade containing more than 10,000 species. So there was some reasons why we did that box, and we will see that. But it's just a box to be able to rationally speak about nature with general concept. Because as I said, we cannot do any biology by giving an individual surname to any fly or any worm we found there. Okay. So this tension came along with the next centuries in that way. I will summarize it by this kind of framework. If you see here similarity is a given. So you need to explain change. And it was not the deal of Linnaeus, because for Linnaeus there was no change at all. So he was self-consistent about that, you know. But for Ernst Mayr in the 20th century, it was a big deal. I have been taught when I was at school that natural selection explains how species change. And this is what you have been learned. This is what you learned at school. If similarity is a given, you have to explain change. If you see change here, what you have is if change is a given, if you are conscious that the real world we are looking at, the real world that science is trying to explain is permanently changing, you have to explain similarity. Why do these individuals look like each other? So this is a very important framework to understand what occurred between the 19th century and the 20th century. Why, the way I was taught evolution, why was it under the main deal, natural selection explains how species change. While if I go back to the 19th century, when I read Darwin, the question is the reverse one. Why did Mayer put a question that is the reverse question of Darwin's question? Darwin's question, what everything is changes at all scales, at the chemical and physical scale. It's not a scoop, actually. So what do we do? How do I obtain similarity while the world is changing? Why did Mayer put it differently than Darwin? So we will answer that question a little bit later. So going back to evolution, in the two schemes you have here, you finish at the end by a picture of stability. Here, these circles symbolize individuals, and individuals finish to have the same color. For Lamarck, 1809, individuals of a population had to, in a way, survive and make efforts to be able to get what they need for. When you are doing efforts, you increase organs. Obviously, if you stimulate your muscles are going to grow. It's just the observation of a physician. Lamarck is looking at living things with the eye of a physician, in a way. He's looking at what happened at the scale of the population, but also what happens at the scale of the variation that occurs. He tries to explain in the same time the initiation of variation and its resulting effects at the scale of the population. So the individuals are making efforts, so they stimulate certain organs, but by default of stimulations, other organs are diminishing, and this increase of organs, or diminution of organs, are transmitted to the next generation. So at each generation, individual seems to fit, their function seems to fit, their structure, their form seems to fit the functions they accomplish, and so on. So please remember that here variation occurs to the need of the user, because it is by an effort that is made by the user that the variation is occurring. Okay. In Darwin, it's slightly different. It's slightly different. 50 years after, you have a diversity of individuals here, a diversity of individuals. Variation occur independently of the needs of the one that is going to that is submitted to the effects. Darwin doesn't really look at the initiation of variations by themselves. He writes that it's useless to do that, because if you do that, you will be lost. You mean if you are interested, if you try to explain each variation occurring, each character of each individual in a population, you will be lost. You need to separate the questions. Okay, variation is occurring. Okay, what is the result? My focus is what is the result at the scale of the population. I don't need to know exactly how variation occur. It's occurring. It's just a matter of observation. But what is the resulting effects at the scale of the population? So this is the way the question is put by Darwin. Some individuals, just by chance, have variation that tends to diminish the number of offspring. Other variations will be inclined to increase the number of offspring. So the favorable variation will accumulate along the lineage because just because they allow individuals to do more offspring, and at the end in the lineage, favorable variations will be accumulated, and this is the way he explains the fit between forms and functions. You obtain an impression of design without designer, if I can say. The difference between the two authors is that here the variation seems to occur for the benefit of the individual. Here the variation occur independently of the needs of the individuals. So some of those variations will make individuals perish. And indeed, there is death. If you see this reasoning, this is the one that is validated today. You have to keep in mind that in evolution, it is counterintuitive for us. In evolution, if you need the lineage to be maintained, you need individual to die, because you have to renovate. You have to renovate the variations. Variations is a kind of assurance for the future, if I can say. Variation is the fuel, is fueling the evolutionary engine. So if you have a variation, you have some probability that the lineage will be maintained through time. Variation and death makes the perennity of a lineage. So the difference between the two authors is not about inheritance of characters gained during the individual life. You know, neither Lamarck nor Darwin knew anything about the way we transmit characters to the next generation. This is not the point. The point is between the two authors. I'm saying that because in the papers you will often find this claim that for Lamarck there is a transmission of the experience of the individual to the next generation, and not for Darwin, which is not accurate historically. Historically, the two authors admit that some changes that the individual experienced during its own life will be transmitted to the offspring. So the difference is not there. The difference is that here the variation occurs to the need of the individual, and here independently of the need of the user. So what do we need to have natural selection? Excuse me, just a detail. Okay, you obtain stability here, or I should say regularity of a phenotype here. But don't forget that there will be some change again. Matter, by definition, matter doesn't stop to change. Matter changes by definition. So you will have new colors occurring here. But during a transitory period, you will have some beneficial variation that will be stabilized, that are going to be stabilized in the population here. So what do we need to basic properties for an entity to be submitted to natural selection? You have variability. It's clear. You don't need to explain how each variation occurs. You just have to see that there is variability. This variability is variable characters are transmitted to the next generation, whatever the way it's transmitted. And if you have variability and transmission to an alter ego, if I can say, you can have a drift. What does it mean, drift? It means that in the big population, different variations at the same character will be the frequencies will be changing just by chance, like that. In the big populations, it will explain part of the stability of what we call polymorphism, different forms of same characters to be maintained in a big population. In a small population, you will have stochastic effects. Some characters that are beneficial will, it's possible that just by chance you have a beneficial character that disappear just because of effects of ça, j'ai un trou d'anglais là. Un tirage aléatoire, comment tu dis? Random draw. Random draw, merci. Random draw, or slightly deleterious characters can be fixed in the population just because of random effects. So, this is the effect of drift in a big population or small population. To have natural selection, you need some constraints, and this system is under constraints. These constraints explain why some variants will do more offsprings than others. So if you have this triptych, variability, transmission, and constraint, you have natural selection. So the interesting question for, not only for biologists, but for scientists in general, is that each time we meet an entity that is varying, that is transmitting the variation to an alter ego and under constraint, it's possible that this entity is submitted to natural selection. Today, we think about that for languages, not only today, for 2 centuries ago, but in terms of natural selection, more recently, languages, cultural items, cells within the same body, proteins, and so on. So proteins, because I won't have the time to go into details on that, but this paper just came out last month, and it explained that proteins are very good candidates for prebiotic world, certainly accompanying nucleic acids, but with a certain precedence that is explained even in the abstracts. There are very interesting molecules that were neglected during 60 years as a main actor of what we call prebiotic evolution. Why? Because you can find in a certain circumstances this triptych obtained for proteins that can transmit to each other three-dimensional conformations to an alter ego. There are no cells here. There are no sex, no stuff like that. Just proteins to proteins. But we will go back on this model later, if you want to. 2 remarks about this triptych. There have been big changes in the transmission module during the last years. This is a paper I took from Lalande's team, explaining the new extended evolutionary synthesis that Lalande is promoting today. I will summarize the situation as is doing it in an old scheme, the scheme I learned at school. You transmit from one generation to the next generation almost only with the genome. What is transmitted from one generation to the next is the DNA of the sexual cells. Inheritance is genetic inheritance mainly with sexual cells. And in the genome, you have a metaphor that back to the 60s, the early 60s, the metaphor of genetic program. And if you say that there is a genetic program, the development itself is the development of a program that is already written. So you are unfolding, development is seen as an unfolding of something that is already written at a small scale. This is the scheme this is the way I learned biology, last third of the 20th century. The new version of this scheme, the today's version, is a slightly different, but is very important. That first of all, from one generation to the next, you don't transmit only DNA from the genome. You transmit far more things, actually, at different scales of organization. From genome to genome, obviously, that's true. That's true. But you also transmit from cell to cell because eggs, there are cytoplasm in eggs. And there are factors that have a certain impact in the cytoplasm of eggs. You transmit from the organism to the cell with epigenetic inheritance. You transmit from organism to organisms. You're transmitting behaviors. You're transmitting habits. You're transmitting food culture, for instance, that retro-select populations. Good examples about milk, human population drinking milk. You transmit from organisms to the environment because some species construct environments that regulates physical factors back selecting populations submitted to the environment. Termites, for instance, social insects, construct buildings where temperature, hygrometry, and other factors that are controlled. And the new generations are not living outside, they are living under the condition, physical condition constructed by the previous generations. I'm thinking about those nests of South African birds. Names of the birds is social republicans. Funny names for a bird. Why? Because they live together. They are several hundreds of birds building a nest of several tons in a tree or in a structure. The nest is up, and there are tens and tens of chambers, and in chambers of the nest, the temperature and the shade is protecting the birds from the hot temperatures of the desert, because it's the Kalahari's desert, southwest Africa. And they all constructing nests, they all constructing conditions into which the eggs and the next generation will be raised. I mean, so the nests are fresher during the day and hotter during the night. So birds are better like that. And those nests can rest for more than 1 century. So tens of years, but also tens of centuries of occupying a same nest. So the niche construction, that is called niche, ecological niche construction, is constructed by the species itself. So the species is participating to its own condition of selection. This is the meaning of this arrow here. The individuals construct environments that is transmitted to the next generation. So we don't transmit only DNA from the germ cells. This is the lesson we learn from. And to finish with that, what is changing is that genes do not control anything. Genes they just impulse. This is a very important difference of word. You always hear everywhere that genes control the embryonic development. And there is a genetic program, you know. There is no program at all. Genes just impulse, poop, and there is a cascade of events where environment interfere. So the embryonic development is not the unfolding of a program, it's construction by itself. So from the genome to the organism, it's not an unfolding of a program, it's the individual is just constructing itself. Genes are not controllers, they are partners, which is a different way to speaking about biology, but a more rich way to speak about the way genes act actually. So I will be back on that in a few minutes later. So I'm going back now about what natural selection explains. This game between stability and change, you find it during the history of natural history. The talk was about history, about evolution, so we need to understand what was about this game about, you know, the ones who see similarity and the one who see change. For Linnaeus, as I said, the given to be observed by the humans was the species. Species were real. We call that in epistemology taxonomic realism. The boxes you're constructing in your mind, you think that they do really exist in nature. And it was the situation for Linnaeus. Linnaeus considered that the species were created by God. God is a factor that explains the stability of species or the regularity of species. Here you have, in this column, you have what explains. Here in this column, you have what is to be explained. You have to explain similarity or regularity, if you prefer. And what is given to your eyes is the species. So you read the table like that. God explained the regularity of species. Okay. Go now to the 19th century. If you go to the 19th century, I summarize obviously, but in 1895, this book is coming out, and you know this title. It's famous, but I would like to focus on the subtitle. The main book of Darwin, The Origin of Species. Between the origin of similarity, the origin of species, the origin of similarity. This is the way Darwin asked the question. And he answered the question not with the word evolution, not with the word transmutation, not with the word transformation. He answered the question with the word preservation. It's about the origin of similarity. The preservation of favored races, you have to understand the word races not in the way you understand it in this century. You need to read variation here. You need to understand variation here. The preservation of favored variations, if you prefer, in the struggle for life. So it's not about evolution, it's about preservation. So you have to understand that what is to be explained by Darwin is regularity at the short term. Natural selection explains the regularity or the similarity, if you prefer, of individuals. And with the regularity of individuals, you do species. Species do not exist. See, you do species because you have to name it. You have to name the things that are there outside. Species are just linguistic conventions. Darwin clearly says that in his text. He says, it's funny, I'm laughing about species because my colleagues do not agree each other about the way a species should be made among the variation of life. Still today, you have controversies about the way you have to cut a variation into different species. Different specialists do not necessarily agree. It's not so obvious. If you look at a cat and a giraffe, it is obvious. I agree on that. But if you do research in taxonomy, you really quickly understand that it's not obvious. So species are the way you are cutting the biodiversity to be able to speak about that. So it is nominalism. It is Darwin's nominalism. Natural selection explains the regularity of the similarity of individuals. Or the short term. At the short term, natural selection is conservative. You will understand that if you look at the long term, the environment will change one day or another. And if the environment is changing, the variations that are selected by the environmental factors, those variations will not be the same. So the mean of the population will change. So on the long term, I agree that natural selection explains how what we call a species change. I agree on that. But we forgot in the 19th century, in the second half of the 20th century, we forgot that for Darwin, at the first glance, natural selection explains it's the origin of similarity. There are consequences of this blank during the 20th century. The consequences is, for instance, about cancer. You may wonder why, but I will explain you. It's not difficult to understand. Before going to cancer, let's have a look to Ernst Mayr. Ernst Mayr is an ornithologist of the 20th century. And he's one of the main actors of what we call the evolutionary synthesis of the 20th century. I won't explain what is the evolutionary synthesis. Just consider that there is some degree of consensus achieved during the 50s and 60s about evolution. And Mayr was one of the main actors of this consensus about what evolution is. But the main point I would like to address here is that for Mayr, species are real. So there is no God here anymore. Why? Because the deal for science is not to speak about metaphysics anymore. It was the case in Linnaeus' time. You know, science were performed by Western Europeans under the control of churches. You know that, but it's not the case anymore in the 19th century and 20th century. So there is nothing about God here. You have to find a natural explanation of natural phenomena. It is a new deal of science at the articulation between. It's not just like that, you know. It took an entire century to be achieved, but it was during the 18th century. For Mayr, natural selection explains the change of species. Why? Because species is a given. It is what I said before. If you see here similarity, species do exist. You have to explain the change of the similarity that is existing. Okay, this is the way Mayr put the emphasis on this understanding of the way evolution should be taught. The reason was because Mayr was an ornithologist, and he has a biological definition of species, where species were understood as a network of population exchanging genes. Mayr looked at nature in the very thin layer of time, you know. And you cannot do biology if you look only at the thin layer of time. Many biological phenomena or structures can be understood fully if you take history into consideration. And if you look at a thin layer of time, you have the illusion that species are real. Obviously, you know that dogs do not make baby with cats. anyone here outside should say, oh, species are real. Okay, elephants do not make babies with giraffes, so species are real. But you cannot do biology in a only thin layer of time. You need the depth of time to understand biological entities. Many of your own organs, the form of your organs, can be understood only through history. You can understand some of your organs cannot be understood only from physical, explanations. Have you heard about, for instance, the aorta, the main aorta, the main canal outside the heart? You have a pump, the heart, and the main canal that going outside it makes a loop of upside down loop, just at the output of the heart, you know. Would have constructed the heart. I will put the heart in the other way, upside down, to have the blood to be sent right from the beginning downstairs. But it's up, and it makes a loop like this. And you can understand the loop only by doing the history of the circulatory system, the paleontological long-term history of the circulatory system. And you understand why there is a loop there. Otherwise, you don't understand the loop. If you are an engineer, you said, "Oh, well, what do you do? Just put the heart upside down, and you have the job done." Okay. So, two actors of the 20th century synthesis, Mayer and Simpson. Simpson, the paleontologist, as a paleontologist, has to consider the depth of time. And if you have depth of time in mind, you have to consider that at one day or another, the two lineages here, if there is a tree of life, and obviously the two guys are Darwinian. They think that biodiversity today is explained, in the depth of time, is explained by a tree of life. If there is a tree of life, the two lineages at one moment or another should meet. If you go from the present to the past, the two lineages should meet. And here, what species do you have? Species are just conventions. So it's not animals here, elephants and giraffes. Here, you don't have an elephant. You don't have a giraffe. You have something in between. I don't know what, but something in between. Oh, okay. If you have an elephant here, explain why it doesn't change in the giraffe's branch. Oh, sorry, in the elephant branch, and it changes in the giraffe branch. If you have a giraffe here, you have to explain why there is a change in the elephant's branch and why there is no change in the giraffe's branch. So if you have something in between, there have been change in the two branches. Anyway, what you have here is a different form that you cannot name the same way as here later. So only if you take the depth of time into consideration, you can realize that species are conventional. And we have cut the tree of life that way. What is a species actually? A species is a portion of genealogical flow until the flow is undivided. When it becomes divided, you have to change the name. The red boxes are just linguistic boxes. It's just linguistic boxes. It's not something occurring in the real world. I mean, what is occurring real here is just a barrier of reproduction here. But it's the only thing that occurs in nature. I mean, you never see Homo erectus mother giving birth to the human in her cave, as in the film, you know, the movie, which is stupid. It's actually confusing linguistic boxes with the real world. It's confusing concepts with entities that the concept is supposed to explain. You will never have a Homo erectus mother giving birth to a human. Homo sapiens sapiens. Oh, it's written on this. Oh, a new species, you know. You document, put another way, you document new species only when you document a barrier of reproduction. It's just that. And this is the criterion under which you will name differently the two daughter branches. Okay. In the 21st century, we go back to Darwin. Natural selection explains the regularity of individuals. There are consequences, as I said. There are consequences even for public health of this. It's not an abstract epistemology. I mean, there are real practical consequences that because natural selection was primarily considered as a factor of change, medical science never imports natural selection into the body. Because medical science needs to fix sickness, needs to fix ill bodies. And the normal body is a body that is functioning. When it doesn't function, you fix it and you are okay. So you need a factor of stability to explain how a normal body is functioning normally. So you don't need a factor of change. You need a factor of stability. But natural selection was not considered as a factor of stability. It was only considered as a factor of change. So medical sciences didn't feel to need a natural selection as an explanative factor of what happens into a body. When I was a student like you, natural selection was for individuals of a species. It was not supposed to be imported into the body. So we manage some sickness, for instance, cancer, with tools, intellectual tools, where the factor of stability was not natural selection, it was the genetic program. During the 20th century, the genetic program was a stabilizing factor that took the place of natural selection. Because we put natural selection outside, we had to explain stability, and we did it with genetic program. The genetic program was made to explain repeatability of an embryonic development and stability. Order became causal. If you use a metaphor like Ernst Mayr did, or like Monod did, or Jacob also did in 1961, if you're using a metaphor of a program, you are considering that the internal body, the stability of the body is maintained by a regularity that is causal. The cause of the stability and the regularity of the body is a program. And program is giving instructions. There is a genetic program, there is genetic control also. The development was unfolding what we call a body plan. And body plan was maintained by architect genes. All these metaphors are instructionist metaphors. Orders are already written in something small, and you just need the moment to unfold what is already written. This kind of thinking has a name in the history of science. It's preformationism. Preformationism. What is going to occur, what is going to come out is already formed at a small scale. Like Hartswecker's microscopes here in 1694, at the beginning of the microscopes, Hartswecker had the illusion to see an homunculus inside a spermatozoa. and he drew the homunculus. Why do the offspring look like their parents? Because there is an homunculus here. To make it short. Yeah. And to my eyes, I am a biologist, so to my eyes, the genetic programs was during the 20th century functioning more or less like this. If you look at the late decades of the 20th century, people started to make some. The program was not so strong. It was strong at the beginning in the 60s and 70s, but when you go to the 90s, they became to say, okay, it's not really a program. The program is soft. The program is adaptative. The program is so there was some change in the way the program was seen, but basically the metaphor was not appropriate for explaining the regularity of what happened. In biology, order is not causal. It's the main difference between chemistry and biology. Order is what you need to explain, because biology is science of variation. Biology deals with entities that are individually, historically unique. All individual here is unique, you know that. But if I look at each of your cells, today we are able to detect it with different tools, very highly sophisticated tools. We know that cells from one cell to another, there are somatic mutations that, for instance, the DNA of two of your cells are not strictly identical. Identity is not part of biology. Identity is a idealistic representation of mathematical representation of the world, but it doesn't concern biology. Even two siblings are different. Let me tell you a story. In the French Institute of Agronomy, they just cloned two cows. They took the eggs. They took the egg at the first cell stage. At the two-cell stage, they separate the cells. So you know what happens in that situation. The two cells restart the embryonic development, and you have true siblings. You have true siblings, but at the end, the adult cows didn't have the same les taches, merde. Hein? Stamps, les taches à la surface de la robe. Stamps? Stain, S-T-A-I-N. Ah, stains, okay. Oui. The two cows didn't have the same stains on their fur. So it means that genes do not do everything, obviously, and what you need to explain is order, actually. Order is not causal. Order is what you need to explain, because biology is science of variation. Each entity, each cell you have has an original history. So my lesson is that order is what you need to explain. Regularity or similarity emerges from a filtered variation. So you could replace in biology some of the words we used in the second half of the 20th century. Okay. The genetic program, there is impulses in a genome. I agree with that. But it's not a control, it's an impulse. Instructions, you can replace it by construction. The genetic program, you can replace it by a construction, actually. And today, many geneticists will acknowledge the fact that environment interfere into the conditions of expression of genes. So if you say that environment interfere, there is no program at all. Or I would say program is not an appropriate metaphor. There is no genetic control, there is a genetic impulse. there is no body plan. You have a phylogenetic mosaic, and when you gain something on the long term in evolution, when you gain some organs, you can lose it. Secondarily, obviously, snakes have lost their legs. We have remains of legs in some snakes, but just by saying that, I mean, there is no plan. Plan is a rigidification of a combination of characters, but there is no rigidified combination of character in nature. Characters can be lost independently of others. It is a mosaicism, evolutionary mosaicism, if I can say. You have lost your tail. Your primate tail is lost. You made a coccyx with it. Well, I won't multiply the examples, but there is no plan. It doesn't mean anything. Unless you need to learn your zoology lesson. But there are no architect genes. There are just early impulses. Ox genes, or the genes that determine body plans, they are important. Why? Just because their main effects are early during the development. So obviously, if you perturb those genes, the consequences are important. But it's just because they are early. It's just because they are architects. I don't know if you feel the difference of the way you speak about biology. And so today, to finish with this part, the two pillars of evolution are entered now into the body. Today it's made now. What are these two pillars? The natural selection and descent. Natural selection, in a few words, you have understood. Descent is just this idea that things you are looking at today is the product of a genealogy. Today, if you look at the literature, for instance, about cancer, evolutionary principles are used to treat cancer. Look at nature here in 2016. Tumors, cancerous tumors, are subject to the same rules of natural selection as any other living things. Clinicians are now putting that knowledge into use. The journal Pour la Science made an entire issue about evolution against cancer, used the evolutionary way of thinking to treat tumors, cancerous tumors. Like that, for instance, Gattenby is explaining that nicely in this Pour la Science, or in Scientific American, the corresponding American journal. You have a tumor here. Each cell is different. Each cell of your body is different anyway. But you have more variation into a cancerous tumor than anywhere else into the body. You have resistant cells in green and sensitive cells in brown, sensitive to the treatment, the molecules. And what we did in the past, because we thought that what a cell should do by default was to be maintained, to be quiet, and being proliferative is a sickness. This is the way we thought in the past. Today we think the reverse. The natural situation for a cell is to be proliferative, and the fact that it doesn't proliferate is a control, a kind of control by the other cells, you know. So to be proliferative is not a sickness, it's natural to be proliferative. Every biological entity does that, even us. Or biological entities are still here today because they were proliferative, because they are still proliferative. Many more biological entity gives birth, are born than the number of them that can able to survive in an environment. You need variation, so you need proliferation to be a lineage to be maintained. This is the way biology is thinking. So cells are not quiet by default, they are proliferative by default. You put the maximum dose, this is the old way of thinking cancer treatment. You put the maximum dose so that you can eliminate sensitive cells. So you diminish drastically the size of the tumor, but doing that, you always leave some of the cells. You cannot kill all of them. It's like antibiotics, you cannot kill all of them. There are always a small number that are still here because there is variation. Biology is science of variation. And you have made room for the small number of the resistant ones to start again, to proliferate. So the tumor is uncontrollable anymore, and you kill the patient. Not always, obviously, not always, but in an important proportion of patients are killed by metastasis obtained by the restart of the proliferation of the small number of ones that were resistant here. And the evolutionary treatment is to take into account that proliferation is by default. So what you need is to maintain a kind of ecosystem that prevent the ones that are resistant to proliferate. Here you free the limits and you allow the resistant one to proliferate because you have eliminated the environment. Here you maintain the environment, so you kill only a small number of them. But each time you put a treatment, the cells between them are in a need to renegotiate their position into the tumor, and so the tumor has its size that is diminished, not completely eradicated, but just diminished. But it's maintained quiet. So this is how Gattenby and his team explain. Treat patients with prostatic cancer, and they have scores of 4 or 5 times the time of survival of the patients with this kind of treatment. So the evolutionary thinking is taken into account into the body now, and it has some consequences in medical sciences. And to finish with the 2 pillars, the phylogeny, actually the descent, descent reasoning, is into the body. Just look at this paper that came out in Science a few years ago, 2018. They took transcriptomes from cells at different stages of development of a zebrafish embryo in the 24 first hours. And they compared the transcriptomes, and they could reconstruct the phylogeny of the development of the tissues. So you have a phylogeny of a developing organism. So you have descent into the body. So the second pillar of the theory of evolution is into the developing body, and we discover here, for instance, that what is mesoderm. Mesoderm is paraphyletic. We have learned at school that in the primitive stages of embryos, you have 3 layers: ectoderm, endoderm, or mesoderms in the between. And mesoderms are paraphyletic because they give birth to endoderm. Endoderm that generates later the digestive tract. And what is surprising is that if you look at the same thing for a frog, the mesoderm is monophyletic here. So the way the primary layers of the embryo are not developing the same way in a fish and in a frog, which is very surprising for the zoologist, Endoderm, mesoderm, ectoderm was supposed to be something very stable. Same example in an oak. I won't go into details. Here in the human. So I finish with this summary. Regularity from order were used during the 20th century to explain how we obtain an individual. It was the ontogeny, as the ontogeny was unfolded by a genetic program. And to explain the regularity of what we are doing as what we call a species, regularity was explained from disorder with natural selection. The biology during the 20th century was schizoid in a way. You had a theory to explain the stability of the species and another theory that was different from the previous one to explain the stability of individuals. And this is what we call the phylogeny here and ontogeny here. Here, regularity was obtained from an order. You will do that. And here, from selecting a fundamental disorder. So if you try to make biology self-consistent, you don't consider that in biology you explain order by order. You have to explain order by a fundamental disorder. So the filtering of a fundamental disorder, which what natural selection is doing actually. So you transfer natural selection into the individual, and so you have what we call natural selection explaining the regularity of individuals and explaining the regularity of a species. This is what we call Jean-Jacques Cupiec's ontophylogenesis. Phylogeny and ontogeny is the same phenomenon. And the evolution is within the developing body. Evolution is within the body, actually. And it's still in your body because today we understand aging with the tools of evolution. Aging is an evolutionary phenomenon. Ontophylogeny. So this is the conclusion of the first part of my talk. Thank you.